And today I am extremely excited to be speaking with a gentleman named Michael Kochenash. Did I pronounce that correct?
You did.
I did. And Michael is here in the United States in New York, but he is, in terms of his research position, he's in China. I wanted to give you a little bit more background, but I just wanted to first say, Mike, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you very much.
And I should say you're a doctor, so Dr. Kochenash. And you're an American New Testament scholar, and your PhD was from Claremont. And you are also a postdoctoral research fellow in Christian studies at Yulu Academy and Hunan University in Changsha, Hunan, China. Hunan University is one of the most prestigious national key universities in China. And just wanted to go through real quickly a little bit of his background. Dr. Kochenash, I'm gonna botch it, I know. Dr. Kochenash had his education starting at Malone University in Ohio, BA in Bible and Theology, his master's in religion at Yale, and his PhD in religion and New Testament at the Claremont School of Theology. His research explores the meaning of early Christian and early Jewish narratives, especially the canonical book of Acts, but also the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of Judas, would that be considered apocryphal?
Yeah.
Okay. So the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Joseph, and the Gospel of Aseneth. Are those all Gospels?
No. Joseph and Aseneth is a Jewish novel.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, exposing my lack of education here.
Yeah, it's kind of obscure, but it's fun.
I'd love to hear more about that here in a second as well. The book of Judith, the Protevangelium of James. How do you pronounce that?
I've heard various things. It's probably easiest to just call it the Proto-Gospel of James.
Proto-Gospel of James.
Which is not what it's, how it's usually written out. But.
And all those books in their ancient Mediterranean contexts. And he's also focused on some projects about the ways that Americans use the Bible in social and political discourse. You are the editor of a book called Christian Origins and the New Testament in the Greco-Roman Context, Essays in Honor of Dennis R. MacDonald. And you're one of, I believe, 3 or 4 editors of that book. And then your book coming out, which we'll get to in more detail in a few minutes, but your book coming out later this year is called Roman Self-Representation and the Lukan Kingdom of God. That's quite a long list of things. You're apparently a very busy person, which is, I've got a lot of questions. And you've been an adjunct professor at Malone University, at Azusa Pacific University, and again now a postdoctoral research fellow at Hunan University in China. So with that in mind, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah. So you want more backstory to that, I suppose?
Well, yeah, not your life story from childhood. We'll get into that in one second, but just more about just what you're up to these days, what life's like for you, and maybe any kind of extras like hobbies you want to tell us about.
Okay. Yeah. Well, so it's COVID, so not a lot of the activities that you'd normally get, but I am here in the United States, living with my wife. And not splitting my time between here and China, which I had been before because of coronavirus. But working on a lot of articles and new books and proposals and conference papers. So there's always something to keep me busy.
Yeah, I looked at your CV and online, which I'll have listed in the article in the YouTube channel video notes below when it's published. But you've been in so many articles, and it goes on and on. I mean, you've really touched a lot. I do want to ask too, just of all that list, what kind of things are your favorite to work on?
So I have sort of figured out that I really enjoy working on narratives, Jewish narratives and Christian narratives, and trying to make sense of how they construct meaning. And I think I've started to focus on what were the stories or images or logics that the audience members already were familiar with, and that the writers could build on in order to construct meaning. So it's rooted in metaphor theory. I was introduced to that, I guess around the time I was in my master's program. Just the way humans think, it's metaphorically based. You take to learn about something abstract, you do it by reference to something concrete and lived. And so that has sort of been guiding the way I think about ancient literature. And in my book, the Roman Self-Representation, that is all about how we interpret Lukan Acts and the presentation of the kingdom of God within it, by reading it in relation to the way Rome presented its own empire. And so ways in which it's similar to it, ways in which it diverges from it, even when it is similar, and what that tells us about what Luke thinks about the Roman Empire, and also has implications for what we think about how we can use these Lucan narratives to think about and reason about the empire or empires within which we live today, especially for Christians who use these as sacred resources.
What you're saying has me firing on all cylinders, and I don't want to go too deep too fast, but since we're on it for a second, can I just ask you two questions, and these are off the cuff, but more like a speed round. With the metaphor theory, is that in any way implying or at least related to the concept that the New Testament was metaphor in the sense of it was obviously parable, such as, John Dominic Crossan points out, but is it mythology, which is more the background I'm coming from, but then secondarily with that question, is it separated by the people that are the initiates, such as in a mystery cult context, there's the initiates who understand the secrets, and then there's the story for the average person. Is that what you're getting into, or is that a separate discussion?
Yes and no. I think I'm not, I think, in the mythology world per se, but what I would say is yes, there can be different levels of meaning for people based on cultural competence, assuming an author intends a certain story to have certain references. The extent to which it does that depends on the author's competence of their knowledge of those things. And so certainly, I mean, that's everywhere. Even something as uncontroversial as the New Testament referring to the Septuagint, right? Or allusions or echoes, like, sure, maybe they were intended, but certain readers may not have picked up on it if they weren't as familiar. Sure. And others would if they were more familiar. And some will see things that the author didn't intend, and you can speculate on how they made them in there.
Just for your best guess from what you've known and have studied, do you think there was an intention to have two kind of stories of, like, if you look at, for example, numerology and gematria, the people expected the people who knew Pythagoras, who knew these Jewish mystical codes, to have a kind of a deeper meaning. Whereas for everyone else, it's just a story. It's just a narrative. It's a nice story. It's got some moral teachings. Do you get the sense, if you had to make a guess, that was an intention, or did they just intend there to be lots of levels, and you pick up whatever level you're at, and if you're ready to go deeper when you're ready?
Yeah, it's kind of a difficult question to answer. Like, I mean, if you want to think about in Revelation with the 666. I think it's hard to make the case that it's not intended as a gematria to refer to Nero. People make that case, I guess, but it doesn't strike me as credible. Right. So I think there are cases where certainly the most credible reading is that the author is doing these things intentionally, whatever these things refers to, but that maybe even the author knew that not everybody would understand it. In Revelation, again, the author often says, let the knowing reader know, or
let him who has ears to hear.
Right. Yeah. So maybe because the author wasn't sure, people would pay attention to something, call their attention to it to make sure they do, which I think speaks to the fact that maybe people weren't, or the author expected maybe they wouldn't pick up on all of them.
Makes sense. What you mentioned as well, Rome. I have to ask, did Rome play a part in the creation of the New Testament, in your opinion? I know that's a big question. Well, there are people that would say, for example, that they were greatly influenced by the Flavian family, by that, and that there weren't just ironies that there was actually intention. For example, when Jesus talks about, he who smites you on the cheek, turn to him the other also. All the other things about, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, that there were obviously a lot of wars going on, struggles where the Jews, the whole Maccabean period, they were struggling against Rome, and Rome was obviously sick of dealing with this. And some people have proposed, such as there's an author named James Valiant. Have you heard of James Valiant? And another gentleman named Joseph Atwill has taken a different spin on it, but people that basically say there was a direct attempt to turn this messianic, apocalyptic, cataclysmic movement that was happening into a pacifist movement. And I guess in that sense, and by the way, James Valiant's book is called Creating Christ, and Joseph Atwill's book is called Caesar's Messiah. But do you get the sense that there was, regardless of that background, was there any sense that you see that Rome was pushing or involved?
I don't get that sense. And I mean, I think getting beyond my very niche area of expertise, later with the formation of the canon, I think you might have a stronger case that there are powers influencing selection of books, but I can't give any examples. But no, my impression of earliest Christianity is that it would not be something that would that the Flavians would bother themselves with.
Gotcha.
But I could be wrong. But no,
yeah,
I'm
it's
not
interesting.
familiar with the argument.
Yeah, it's an interesting thesis. I think the other part that always strikes me is the passage where Paul, I believe in one of the epistles, I think it's in Romans, I might be misremembering this, but he talks about obeying the powers that are above you, that they're put there by God, they're given the sword by God, so therefore obey them. And it does make you wonder. It does seem like there's at least hints of it that you can't help but start to explore. Well, before I go down any more rabbit trails, I did want to ask you, what was life like for you and your wife in China? And do you expect to be getting back there anytime soon?
It's different and not different. It's a unique experience for someone born and raised in America with white skin to go and be a minority where some people speak English, but most people prefer not to, if they even are able to. But there were accommodations at a lot of places with like picture menus and people who were, for the most part, very generous about my lack of ability to speak Chinese.
Did you get pretty fluent at any point, or?
No. So I mean, some very basics I could use, but I never really used it because people would look at me and they'd say hello. A lot of people would want to try out, work on their English with somebody who appears to be a native English speaker, and they were right about that.
That's awesome.
And so people would mostly try to speak English to me, people I'd be comfortable with trying to practice my Chinese on anyway. And I never really got to the point where I had a very expansive, like I could say, hello, my name is, nice to meet you. I don't speak Chinese. Do you speak English? And that's
enough to get yourself in trouble, right? At least that's how I feel. I took Japanese for 2 years in Bible college, which usually people associate with Greek and Hebrew, which I did as well, but I took 2 years of Japanese, and they got a little bit into kanji, which is the Chinese characters that they weave into the Japanese, and boy, is that is overwhelming. I couldn't even start to get it.
It's you're right. It's overwhelming. It's basically a third language, understanding Chinese to speak it and to hear it, as opposed to read it and write it, because there may be some correlation between the characters and the sounds, but I think it's obscure, and I never learned it. But yeah, it's very difficult for me. It was, at least. Yeah.
Well, if you do go back, certainly best wishes for getting more and more acclimated. And did you expect to go back anytime soon?
No, not for my current program. If I got a different appointment, then I'm sure I would. But no plans right now, especially with COVID.
Yeah. Do you miss some of the food you got there?
I've got probably the lamest taste for food.
Okay.
So Hunan is really famous for their food and specifically their spicy food. And I did get some of that, but I'm awful. I'd eat at McDonald's once a week and eat a lot of just like ramen noodles type stuff and peanut butter sandwiches.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Nice.
I will admit, I would love to try just, the whole cliche of, American Chinese food isn't the real stuff. And I would love to try it sometime.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I wanted to ask just more of an icebreaker, really quick 30-second question. What is your favorite season and why?
Well, we're here. Autumn, I think, is my favorite season. I like the break from summer heat. I like pumpkin spice lattes. I like wearing sweaters. Those are my reasons.
Yeah, good answer. I like that. So I wanted to ask, just to start to get into some of the meat of our conversation, could you tell us about your faith journey? And just for everyone's understanding, I haven't heard this story before, so I don't know everything that we're going to hear here from Dr. Kochenash, but I'm excited to hear it. I'll probably ask some questions as we go, but everything in terms of the highlights from how your parents raised you to, basically everything to where you are today, and maybe a clarification of where were the big turning points? Was there anything that you would consider a major shift, or was it gradual? Anything like that.
Yeah, it was definitely gradual. And I guess we can do the spoiler and say I do identify as a Christian still, but not the same kind of Christian as I was previously. So I was born and raised in Georgia, in Gwinnett County, and was raised in the Christian church, the denomination Christian Church, Church of Christ. Stayed with that through into my college years, even when I moved to Pennsylvania. In high school, I was into like youth group stuff, like a lot of people, I guess. And youth group Bible studies, and that got me really interested in the Bible. And so then when I went to go to Malone, it was Malone College, now it's Malone University. My plan actually was to be a business major with a Bible minor. And the ultimate career goal was to own my own Christian bookstore, which in hindsight, I can see that I dodged a bullet. Like Amazon sort of obliterated local bookstores. But in my haste to dodge that bullet, I've also sort of leaned into a hailstorm of the bullets that are the modern academy and the awful job market. So I went to Malone. The business classes were boring, but I did well at them. But I really enjoyed the Bible classes and ended up switching.
What was when you were, like, what stage were you at that point? You said you've shifted. Were you in Bible college still at the same kind of basic theological place you'd been before Bible college?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was shifting, but it hadn't shifted, I would say.
Okay.
So for instance, the hermeneutics class at Malone usually did two types of case studies where you did term papers talking about an issue and how you interpret the Bible for that issue. And they were women in ministry and homosexuality. And I sort of followed the lead of the professor, which was to affirm women in marriage, but to say homosexuality is a sin, which is, I don't know if I had any thoughts on women in ministry before going to college. I'm a man, so I didn't feel the need to think about it, which acknowledging is not awesome. But that's it didn't feel revolutionary to explicitly affirm, of course, women can be in ministry, hold positions of leadership. Why wouldn't they? They're human beings. But at the same time, the Bible does seem to condemn homosexuality. So I probably stayed on those issues. I mean, I continue to affirm women in leadership. I no longer think of homosexuality as a sin, but there wasn't really a moment that changed my opinion on that. I think it was more growing up and growing older and learning about gender not really being a binary, and well, what do you do with the non-binary situation? And people are attracted to other people involuntarily. So why would that be something they should be condemned for? And I currently don't think that the Bible does condemn homosexuality. In part is kind of a cheat, you might say, but homosexuality as a concept didn't exist before a couple hundred years ago. So the Bible can't condemn it. That helps some of us, I guess.
And at what point would you say that some of the shifts in your definition of Christianity started to change? Was that in your postgraduate work?
Yeah, I think on that issue, it was post Yale, maybe while I was at Claremont. I'm not 100% sure. And not from any coursework I was doing, maybe just from having conversations with friends about it, or with my wife, and
I assume your wife's a believer.
Experiencing the world. Say that again?
I assume your wife's a believer?
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
And what was it that started to give you some reason to think about things any differently than you had before?
So about that specific issue?
No, just about the gospel, about the Bible, about Jesus and salvation.
Yeah, well, I would say, at least in terms of moving out of evangelicalism, after grad school, I think in grad school, I still would have identified as, so in my master's, I mean at Yale, I still identified as evangelical, maybe less proudly so, but as the years went on, it became more and more clear that evangelical was as much or more a cultural designation than a theological one. And I didn't agree with certainly the cultural implications of evangelicalism, and also not the theological. So identified less and less as evangelical. And now I don't know where the break was. I certainly don't. I actively do not identify as evangelical at this point.
Gotcha. So what happened next in terms of any other changes? Or would you say that's pretty much where you're landing, is just a more, would you call it a liberal or progressive Christianity, or where are you now? Yeah,
it's tricky. It's tough. It's hard to find the right kind of church when you have opinions about these sorts of things, and you think those opinions matter, and you don't necessarily enjoy all styles of doing church, and so it's I wish I could find something that worked for me and my wife, and that existed. So at the moment it's tough. We've hit when we lived in Los Angeles. So at the end, during my PhD program at Claremont, we did find a really good progressive Methodist church. Of course, the Methodist Church itself has some issues, but this is one of the good ones, sort of near downtown Los Angeles. But so that was a good home, a good fit for us for a few years. But then I went to China. We went to China, and so now we're in rural Western New York, and there aren't a lot of churches, much less a lot of progressive ones. So it's a little tough.
So just before we move on from this part, I just want to clarify. Did you grow up in a context where you felt the gospel was clear? And what I mean by that is just to set definitions and baselines. You are at birth already condemned because you're a child of Adam. You sin, doubly damning you before God. So you therefore are absolutely fallen and in need of grace, in need of some kind of provision. That God says that those who have fallen short of his glory, and the wages of sin is death, eternal death, separation from God, and punishment. And then you get to the Old Testament sacrificial lamb, the Passover lamb, the blood being the means, the life being in the blood, and the blood being the means by which the sin gets transferred to someone else, the scapegoat. And then you get to Christ, the final Passover lamb, the perfect Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And his blood is shed. He takes on all the world's sin, past, present, future. And that when it's all said and done, and he's, died and resurrected, you now have the finality of the gospel picture. And the idea is for people who are, sinners and realizing it, they place their faith in Christ as their atonement, as their substitute. And by identifying with his death and resurrection, they become, placed in a right relationship with God. Their sin is cast away. They have peace with God. And now they know that they're going to someday, see him face to face in glory. That gospel, the idea that you're redeemed, you're saved from your sin unto God, was that clear to you growing up? And do you have any thoughts on that now that are different?
I think the churches I grew up in probably did. They're probably very clear on that. I don't remember much about it. I do remember conversations with my parents or with other people in youth groups about, well, what happens to a baby who dies, or like, are they condemned? But I think the consensus we came up with was, I think there's a Catholic concept of being under grace, and we thought that was pretty good. So there is an age, do they call it an age of
accountability?
Accountability, yeah. So we thought that was a pretty clever way of working around that. And so that's good for as far as it goes. I think I've become less theologically certain about things. I'm a lot more at this point willing to say, well, I believe in God, and I believe God is perfectly just. And so anything in terms of judgment or so I actually was influenced in high school. I read a book for one of my English classes called Cold Sassy Tree. It's about Georgia, actually, around turn of the century Georgia. And this child is in a relationship with has a relationship with his grandpa, and that's one of the themes of the book. And I think what I perceived to be one of the climactic scenes, the child was asking his grandpa about, and shoot, now I'm forgetting the context. The Lord is my shepherd, I think was the question. What does it mean, the Lord is my shepherd? And the grandpa says something to the effect of, well, the Lord is my shepherd means you trust God for whatever happens in the next life. And even if there is no next life, then it's fine. God made it that way. Why wouldn't it be fine? And that to me is a wonderful picture of what faith ought to be, and what I've sort of grown into. I'm not going to be dogmatic about thoughts I have about things that are you can't prove them anyway. So what's the point of being dogmatic about that?
Sure. I wanted to ask a little bit about how your journey affected your time at the schools you taught at, and you mentioned offline that there was a situation where there was a Christian school, an evangelical school that you taught at, and there was a little bit of an issue because of some of the things that you were learning and I guess sharing. Could you, without our goal is obviously not to make anyone at that school look bad, but just to tell us your story. I'd love to hear it, because I've heard some similar stories, and where people, like I've heard of, there's one gentleman, he's a Christian apologist even, he lost his position because he made the simple question of, were the dead people that were walking around Jerusalem after his death and resurrection, or after his death, was that story real, or was that mythology or legend or anything? And just because he, I think, suggested it,
might not be literal.
He lost his job at a
Right.
at a Christian university, I believe. And so I'm just curious what your experience was like, and obviously not in a bitter sense, but just what was that like, and do you see the kind of experience you had happening more widespread?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll tell that story. And I think we might. One reason it will be helpful is because it'll sort of lead into something I know we want to talk more about, which is the use of literary models and mimesis.
Yeah.
But so this was while I was at my program at Claremont, and I guess thinking back to what we were talking about earlier, I would still, I wasn't really considering myself evangelical, but thought that there could be a place for me at an evangelical university. And I thought of all places, this particular school might have been open to it. So I taught there for 3 years. And what happened at the end of the third year, I had already had my courses on the schedule for the fall and people were enrolled. But by the end of the third year, I got an email saying, we've decided not to extend your contract. If you want to know what it's about or why this is, yeah, we can talk. I said, well, yes, I'd like to find out. And so eventually had a meeting with a couple of individuals. And what it boiled down to was I had apparently violated a rule that is not actually a rule. Like it's not, and I confirmed this with other faculty members there that they said, no, there's no rule or expectation that this is the case. But what they said the reason was is I assigned too many readings that did not conform to the evangelical perspective of the university, to which I didn't disagree. Like the point of assigning them wasn't because they conformed, but because they were relevant to what I wanted to talk about in the class. And the way I'm told it went down was, so it was the very first reading assignment in the semester. And what it was is, you're probably familiar, Dennis MacDonald.
Sure.
Do you know his book, Mythologizing Jesus?
I've not read it, but I know about it, yeah.
Yeah, so in the first chapter, he introduces to a popular audience the idea of using literary models in composing gospel literature. And I thought that would be helpful because what I wanted to talk about throughout this semester, not exclusively, but a major theme is the use of literary models and composing in the composition of early Christian narratives. The class was specifically on Luke and Acts. So I knew, so Dennis uses, he probably wouldn't disagree, he uses language that is off-putting to especially evangelicals by describing the Gospels as fiction. Especially, I think that's the biggest issue. And so I knew it could rub some of the students the wrong way. And so I paired it with, do you know Pete Enns?
Yeah.
He's a Hebrew Bible professor. So he wrote the book, The Bible Tells Me So. And there's a chapter in that book that says God lets his children tell the story. And in that chapter, he talks about how the book of Joshua, from what we know about archaeology, appears to not have, it's not true in what we would call in a historical sense. But that doesn't mean it is not helpful or it doesn't have meaning. And so he talks about how if we think about human beings, ancient Israelites expressing who God is in culturally meaningful ways, like that's how we should maybe understand it. So I put those two readings together, and the idea was to have them read those both, and then in the next class we would come and talk about the MacDonald reading and what is he up to. Why do you think I paired that with this chapter about Joshua? This is a New Testament class. And then, well, if you thought Pete Enns was writing this chapter by MacDonald, how would he have phrased it differently? And so that was the conversation that we were supposed to have after that. And then we'd get into more. But what they told me happened was a student got the reading after that first introduction class, so before the lecture, and was offended, I guess, by the MacDonald reading, gave it to I presume his father, who then spoke to the university president, who then went down the chain to find out who it is that is using this reading assignment. And they eventually found out it was I who was doing it. And instead of having a conversation like, Mike, why are you using this? Or can you use a different reading or something, they just thought it best to let me go. And in the conversation where they were explaining what happened, in no uncertain terms, they said, in this class, students need to learn that the virgin birth is real and the resurrection happened. Like that's it. That's all they need, and it has to be those things. And the readings that they were looking at don't call those into question. It's not about either of those things.
Yeah.
But underscored that, especially apparently, a lot of evangelical schools are not interested in. Yeah. At least it can be interpreted as indicating that a lot of evangelical schools are not really interested in critical thinking or anything like that. Just confirmation bias. Confirmation bias.
That's an amazing story. And I mean, number one, I feel awful that it happened to you, but number two, it kind of is parallel to not my experience in terms of being on the receiving end of it, but in the sense that when I deconverted from Christianity about a year ago, one of the major concerns and beefs that I had was, why wasn't I told all this stuff? And
right.
It's like, if only for the sake of saying, you know what, Dr. Kochenash might not, did I say that right?
Yeah.
Dr. Kochenash might not be trying to lead us astray, or he might not be trying to deconvert us, but he's, obviously you're a Christian, you're not trying to deconvert anybody. But if the atheists on the outside are going to say, hey, have you heard of Dennis MacDonald? This book sounds like mythology. We don't think it's real. Why not at least prepare them and say, hey, this is what a lot of secular scholars who are very, very well regarded in their field, they think this is relevant information. At least present it and then give the contra argument as opposed to just burning your head in the sand.
Preaching to the choir.
Yes.
It seems like intuitive, right? And especially if, I don't think universities should be necessarily preparing people to think a certain way, but if that is your goal, why wouldn't you want them to go out and be prepared to, like, having thought about these things already in a safe environment where they could dialogue and figure out precisely what they think and why, just send them out into the world without that. It seems absurd. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about your upcoming book? That's called, again, Of Kings and... No, I'm sorry. I was misreading that. Roman Self-Representation and the Lukan Kingdom of God. And I'll just read, if it's right, the description. Framed within a discussion on the use of biblical texts for reasoning about social, cultural, and political realities, the book Roman Self-Representation and the Lukan Kingdom of God explores the construction of the Kingdom of God in Luke and Acts through the lens of Rome's presentation of its own empire. By evoking the audience's lived experience of Roman rule, its stories, works of literature, monuments, and images, the Lucan narratives communicate about God's kingdom in a culturally meaningful way, sometimes mirroring, sometimes diverging from, and sometimes subverting the logic of these expressions of Roman rule, touching on a wide range of issues, including gender, ethnic representation, status disparities, economic and military imperialism, and violence. This book is suggestive regarding both the Lucan vision of the kingdom of God and Lucan dispositions toward aspects of Roman rule. Now that, to someone like me, is a lot quick. Can you break that down and what does that exactly mean for someone who's like myself, who just wants to understand how did this thing start?
Yeah, so in essence, you can break up the substance of the book into two sections. One about Jesus specifically, and the other about the kingdom of God. So Jesus specifically as a what I call a foundational figure of the kingdom of God, and then the other one about the expansion of the kingdom of God. And I say the way that Jesus is presented can be read as evoking the way Augustus presented himself or was represented later, the way that other foundational figures, including Julius Caesar, but also mythical figures like Aeneas and Romulus, who are very present in Roman self-representation, during the Roman Empire, right? So coterminous with the Christian era, you might say. So the ways in which those figures are presented seem to be mirrored. And what I would say is, I do think Jesus existed as a human being, but what Luke does, I think, is constructs his image of Jesus using, by reference to these examples that his audience would have been familiar with. So living within the Roman Empire, you experienced Roman rule. You experienced the way that the emperors present themselves, the way that later emperors represented themselves in relation to Augustus as sort of a prime example of what an emperor should be, and Augustus's relation to the gods and his descent from Aeneas, who was the son of Aphrodite or Venus. Right. So the way that Luke presents Jesus seems to be evoking those frameworks and those points of reference. And by reading Luke and Acts that way, you can draw conclusions about what Luke is communicating about Jesus. And so for instance, I look at the genealogy of Jesus, and I foreground something. This is also an article you might have seen on my CV about the genealogy goes back to all the way to Adam, and then calls Adam the son of God, which is not usual. It's not common to call Adam God's offspring. And so I was wondering about that and remembered that, there's a lot about the conception of Jesus that recalls stories about Augustus being conceived in the temple of Apollo when his mother was sleeping there and when was bitten by a snake. And so you have Augustus with one divine parent, Apollo, but also his ancestor Aeneas was the offspring of Aphrodite. And so given that Luke presents Jesus as the offspring, the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of holiness overcomes Mary and she will conceive. So God is in some sense Jesus's father, but also his descendant Adam is described as son of God. And so Jesus, much like Augustus, has two links to divinity. And I think by reading it this way, I think readers would conclude that Jesus is similar to Augustus, not that he's greater because of this. It's basically using the same formula and applying it to Jesus. And lets readers know that, how important Augustus was, about the golden age he inaugurated. Jesus is similar. We're thinking of Jesus in the same way, like the kingdom of God he inaugurates is as important as or more than the golden age. And if you wanted to see a rivalry, you could, because Augustus was described as the heir to Aeneas's empire without end. But then by the time Luke is writing the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts, the Julio-Claudian dynasty has ended. And so it's not really a kingdom without end for them. But Jesus raised from the dead. And so Jesus' kingdom is unending.
It sounds like there's a lot of parallels. And I know you said you do take the position that there was a Jesus at the beginning. I do lean more towards the mythicist position that it probably was made up, but that'll be a discussion for another day. But assuming that there was a guy, I just want to make sure I kind of repeat back to you in my own words and see if it's correct. Are you in any way implying that some of the stories were not real, they were just copies of these other guys and kind of put onto him, mythologized, the legends were added onto and the layers just piled up? Or are you saying, no, all the stories happened as they were written, but they tried really hard to write it in a way that would make you think of those guys, even though it was just two separate stories?
I think as a historian, I feel like I can't say. Okay. I think the best, for me, what I find the most convincing way to think about it is maybe something happened, maybe something didn't. I'm not bothered by the idea of the author of Acts inventing something, or the author of Luke inventing something, a story about Jesus. But I don't think I can always know, right? So Dennis MacDonald talks about the death of John the Baptist in Mark's Gospel being an imitation of, I think, an episode with Agamemnon, but I don't remember the specifics. But he doesn't say that Mark invented John the Baptist being killed, but he does argue he presents it in a way that communicates a certain meaning about it. And so there are a number of things in the Gospels and Acts where we have external attestation to their having happened, but certainly not to everything. I don't feel like I have the data to make decisions about which are true, which are not. I do feel confident that what we have has been crafted to express meaning about Jesus or Peter or Paul. I read it as references to literary models or the Roman self-representation.
Does that imply, do you think that all the characters in the New Testament were real people?
I don't know. I mean, I think there are some that I feel confident about. Others, I just think it doesn't matter. Sure. So Jesus, I do think existed. Peter and Paul, I think existed. James, the brother of Jesus, I would say probably existed. Beyond them, I'm not. I might be forgetting somebody who's important, but it strikes me as not a super important question.
Okay. Could I ask that we're touching on? I think I mispronounced this as mimesis. You pronounce it as mimesis, but mimesis, imitatio. We're touching on it. Before I dive into it, which I do want to give a brief intro to it, and that's kind of the core of what we're going to spend the rest of our time in the meat of this conversation. But it because of what we just talked about, it kind of gets to the elephant in the room for me, which is if mimesis exists, and I know some people don't know what we're saying yet, so we'll define it in a second. I apologize, but if it exists and it's happening, and there's at least a chance that some of these stories are made up, does that have implications for Christianity being true and real? And did that ever shake your faith, or does it now if it didn't before? If you, for example, came to the conclusion, just pulling something out of the air, that the story of the Walking Dead after Jesus' crucifixion was made up, and perhaps because it was copied from some other story, or that the story of Jesus walking on the water, where you perhaps looked at some other stories, and you, for whatever reason, got convinced this, like in some other story, is like this happened, and then this happened, and this happened, this happened, and it's like, okay, I got 10 points in a row, and they're in this specific order. And then you go over here to the Gospels, and the same 10 things in the same order, and sometimes even the exact word or a version of it in Greek. And the first one was written, 500 to 700 years earlier. And then you get to the Jesus story, and you're like, this could be a really interesting irony, but it's just an irony, or there could be some kind of copying here. Does that do anything to your faith? And with the school situation, that is part of the concern, is that do you go down the rabbit trail, not you, but does a Christian go down the rabbit trail and say, if there's any chance that this one story is fake, then maybe that story is fake, maybe that story is fake, and maybe the Jesus story is fake, at which point, where does it stop? And I guess, do you find that that's part of what your journey has been at all? And if not, do you find it threatening to other people?
I don't know if that is precisely what people find threatening about it. You're probably right. If I had to guess, it would probably be something like that, some kind of slippery slope.
Yeah, that's a good word for it.
It didn't bother me. I think when I was in my master's program, I had a moment where in a class with Adela Collins. We were talking about, I think it was Mark, and I don't remember the specific topic, but something about like the historical Jesus might not have done what the Gospel of Mark says, or the best reconstruction of historical Jesus. And for me, that I think there was a moment of, wait, what? But I worked through it, and I don't think the use of literary models has ever really felt like a barrier to me, which maybe made the situation at the evangelical school all the more frustrating, because it hasn't felt like a threat to my faith. I feel like it need not. So
when someone says it does it make sense at all, or does that sound like they're taking leaps that aren't necessary?
I think they're taking leaps that are unnecessary. Strictly speaking, they're inclined to take them, and they have the power, and they can do what they want. Right. But yeah, so I think one of your first questions was about does looking at the Bible this way affect Christianity, or the truth of Christianity? Yeah. And of course, that all depends on what you mean by Christianity and what you mean by truth, in all seriousness. Because so in the class that I taught that was on Luke and Acts, we would spend some time on Luke's preface, where he talks about I'm writing to give you a true account in order, and there are ways of reading that in kind of a literal sense of trying to correct mistakes in Mark and Matthew, and certainly there are places where Luke does make redactions that are best considered correcting grammar, or even what he would consider something that was mistaken. But I don't think that's the best definition of true. What I tried to get my students to think, if I can say it that way, they weren't graded on whether or not they agreed with me, but the perspective I tried to present to them, which was new to most of them, is that Luke telling a true story doesn't need to mean Luke telling a story that is factually accurate in every detail. There's a different way of understanding true. A true story about Jesus and the early church could be a story that accurately conveys the meaning of Jesus and the early church. So what is the importance of Jesus? What is the importance of Jesus's followers? And
more metaphorically speaking then at that point.
What's that?
More metaphorically speaking. In other words, a metaphor as opposed to a literal story.
It's communicating a message about Jesus. Is that message true? And I think that's what I think is the best way of understanding what Luke is saying. Like, he wants to not tell a factually true story, which is kind of an absurd modern projection onto what Luke could mean, but rather a true story in the sense of communicating Luke's understanding, whoever Luke is, we'll call the author Luke, Luke's understanding of who Jesus was, so trying to communicate the meaning in a culturally meaningful way. So using the previous Gospels, but also telling a different story.
Well, could I ask, I want to get into mimesis in just a second, but just as a quick follow-up, when you speak with someone like me, very, very deeply ingrained, indoctrinated in evangelical Christianity, memorized literally thousands upon thousands of verses, word for word, literally copied the Bible, went to Bible college, went to mission school. I had two books that I was working on, manuscripts, 1,000 pages long, about Christian worldview and about prayer. This was my world. And you have someone like me and others who've, different details, but same outcome. They look at this and they start to add the piles of, and it's not one thing, it's not mimesis, it's the discrepancies, it's the moral stuff, the genocide, land theft, slavery, racism, misogyny, child kidnapping, child brides or worse. They go through that stuff. I'm like, I didn't hear that part of Noah. Noah and the ark is just the animals in the boat. Well, he drowned people. According to the story, obviously I don't think it's real, but he drowned all these people, including little babies. Little
Joshua, even more explicit in that sense of wipe out the people who live in the land.
Absolutely, and then take the young girls that had not been touched by man, take them back with you, and slaves, if you beat your slave and as long as they get up off the ground within 2 days, you don't get punished. But if they die, that's the only time you get punished. You can bequeath them to your children. The land theft, the racism, it just goes on and on. Stoning, genital mutilation, all straight from the Bible. And then you start there, and at that point you're more offended by the Bible as opposed to thinking maybe it's not real. It's just offensive, and it feels like a tribal book. Tribal warfare book. But then you go into these other issues of the mimesis, the imitatio, the idea that the Jewish writers were trying to create a copy of a new Moses, a new Joshua, a new Adam. It's all about he's not fulfilling prophecies. He's just the new copy of the old version. And so they use the old stories as the examples. For example, where it says not one of his bones will be broken in the Old Testament. Well, you're going to put that in the New Testament. They're not going to break his bones. So they write it based on these stories, and you think, okay, so he wasn't fulfilling prophecy. They just copied the stories, and most likely. And then you start to look at things like, in my case, you look at Asherah Theology, which is, I know we're not going to dive into that today, but I just discovered that's huge in the Bible. I had no idea how it's woven into so many stories. Just case in point, the big point, Jesus crucified between two thieves. That the core story of the whole Bible, the crucifixion, it's an astrotheological symbol that anyone that knew about the Astro Theology would have said, that's a picture of the stars, crucified between two thieves. Very clear to anyone that knows about that stuff. And so you add that on, and you add the stuff where Pythagoras is woven into the New Testament, and they begin to say, this sounds really man-made. Really man-made. What do you say to someone like that? Obviously to me, but just to anyone that's going on that path. Do you think that they're misunderstanding a lot of what they're reading? And do you have, maybe to flip it a different way, do you have respect for someone who's deconverted, in the sense of, obviously not just social disrespect, but just, do you have a respect for the intellectual position that they said, I can't see this as being divine anymore?
Yeah, no, I don't tell people what to think. I think I have a different way of framing some of those issues.
Okay.
I think, I don't know. In my experience, it seems like a lot of times it's often the case, if you were taught to think one way about the Bible and you learn that it can't work that way, that might affect what you do next.
Yeah.
And so if you weren't really forced to think a certain way, then it might be easier to adapt. Right? There are a lot of different, even evangelical ways of reading the Bible. So when I taught at that evangelical school, one of the things they made us do that I thought was actually kind of good was to use a book that compared Wesleyan ways of reading the Bible with fundamentalist ways of reading the Bible. Both are perfectly at home in the evangelical world, but quite different in how they make sense of Scripture and inconsistencies or anything like that. And so there are a lot of ways of reconciling those issues. I think
I've heard that before in that sense. Yeah, I've got friends that have said, based on how literally you were taught it or indoctrinated it, your response is obviously going to reflect that. And it's more of a shock to your system if you grew up in a literalist as opposed to having some nuance.
Right. And it sounds like with your background with I'm not sure if you're being literal with 1,000-page books that you were writing on.
Yeah, it was very
that's intense.
Yeah, those were literally big 1,000-page books, and it was literal Christianity in the sense of, everything. There was a Noah, the earth is 6 to 10,000 years old, blah, blah, blah. It was basically evangelical Calvinism.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah, Calvinism might be the issue there. But thinking about like astral or Pythagorean influences on the New Testament, the way I've been starting to think, and I'm actually reading a book right now about Jewish Christianity and the scholarly construction of the category Jewish Christianity, and how looking at scholars like F.C. Bauer, who's sort of the giant of New Testament historical criticism. But the way those scholars categorize different groups of Christians reflected what they were interested in doing. Like they had an enlightened view of the world, and they were Christians. And what made sense to them was to say that true Christianity is this sort of liberal enlightenment. And if that's what true Christianity is, then original Christianity must have been that as well, because otherwise it has less authority, or it would feel like it has less authority. And then you have to explain why the New Testament is different from that, and how there are all these other different Christianities. And so what you get in the history of scholarship is a lot of people interpreting the different forms of Christianity as what they called not deviations. What's the right word? Pollutions. What is? I'm forgetting the word.
No worries. It'll come back to us.
it'll come to me the minute we're over here. It'll pop in my head. But bad deviations from corruptions, I think is maybe the right word. So they see them all as corruptions of this true form of Christianity. Right. And that I think is what people don't usually agree with Bauer, F.C. Bauer specifically, but a lot of ways of thinking about Christianity in the New Testament reflects that way of thinking. Like our way, like what we think to be true must be true Christianity, because it makes sense to us. Yeah. And if that's true, original Christianity must have been that too. And then we have to explain why the Gnostics disagreed with us, or why the Ebionites disagreed with this. And so they construct ways of those that are corrupting influences of the Neoplatonists or the Jews, they'd say. Right. But I think I've been thinking more and more that a better way of thinking is not in terms of one true Christianity out of which there's maybe a strain that was true, or maybe it disappeared and then came back, and there were all these corruptions. I think the better way to think of it is there's Christianity or Jesus following Jews or something like that. We'll say Christianity for the sake of simplicity. But people understood it differently, and they wanted to communicate about it in culturally meaningful ways. And so they used the frames of reference that were readily available to them, that made sense to them. So Pythagorean ways of thinking, or Neoplatonic ways of thinking, or Homeric or Septuagintal ways of thinking, and explained what Christianity, what Jesus means, the Jesus moment means to them. And when you look at them all different, they're not the same. They don't. Some are contradictory. That's fine, I think. But some people don't think it's fine. But I think that might be a more accurate way of thinking about what was going on. It's especially early, the first couple hundred years was before you get orthodoxy and heresies. You just have a lot of people explaining who Jesus is in ways that make sense to them, or who Peter was, or Paul, or what salvation means in ways that make sense to them.
With what you just said, what was that time frame, as far as you've studied, was that a fairly violent period in the sense of the church fighting, or was it just more, like, I know people would write a lot of letters, like contra self-sis and all that, books against each other, but was it physically violent at all, or was it just sectarian discussions that got very heated.
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, it wasn't violent, but it's not it's a topic I'm gaining, my interest is growing in, and I haven't looked into it that specifically. I don't,
Yeah.
to my knowledge, no. I mean, at this point, Christian groups are pretty marginal in terms of power in society.
Gotcha.
I mean, there are rich Christians who have a measure of power, right? They're the ones who are sponsoring copies of the Gospels, for instance, or hosting meetings. So that there are people with power, but I think big picture, they're not very powerful. And so I don't think I'd be surprised if I learned that they had the power to actually inflict violence, more than just rhetorical violence, so actual physical violence.
Yeah, and I'll admit I need to study that as well. I'm curious. I know that it got violent, later for sure, horribly violent in several different parts of the church history. But I wanted to make sure we didn't use up all of our time looking to the big heavy hitter topic, and that is mimesis. And I wanted to, if I could, give a 3 or 4 minute intro to this. I'm going to give an example, and I wanted to kind of see what you thought, or basically for someone that's never heard this before. I'd like to ask, if someone says, I don't understand what's going on, why do these things look the same? What's happening here? Just for you to give an intro. I'm going to give a couple different examples. I'm actually going to start with a longer one. This is a different one that I mentioned before, but go through this very quickly. So Odysseus, the Odyssey, there's a man named Odysseus, and there's a story specifically about Cyclops, and this was written about 700 years before the New Testament. And I want to compare that a little bit with the story of Jesus and the demon-possessed man. So Odysseus sails with several ships with a crew of men to a distant land, the land of the Cyclops. Jesus sails with several ships and a crew of men to a distant land, the land of the Gadarenes. Odysseus disembarks and tells all but 12 of his crew to stay in the ships. Jesus disembarks and goes alone while all 12 of his crew remain on the ship. Odysseus meets Cyclops Polyphemus, I might be mispronouncing that, in a cave, and Jesus is immediately greeted by a demon-possessed man coming out of a tomb or a cave-like structure. The Cyclops asks Odysseus his name. Jesus asks the demon-possessed man his name. Odysseus says, my name is nobody, or no man. The man in the Jesus story says, my name is Legion, meaning thousands of men. Odysseus blinds the Cyclops, thus defeating him. In the Gospel, Jesus sends the demons out of the man, thus defeating them. Odysseus and his remaining men escape by riding on the underside of sheep. The demons escape the man by riding inside of pigs. Odysseus and his men then return to the ship, and Jesus returns to the ship. Odysseus calls back to the shore and taunts the Cyclops, declaring himself king. Jesus calls back to the shore, but does not reveal he is king. So that is one example. The next one, the woman washing the hero's feet analogy, Odysseus versus Mark. In the Odyssey, a woman named Euryclea meets a stranger, Odysseus. In Mark, a woman meets Jesus. Odysseus is recognized by the woman as someone worthy. Jesus is recognized by the woman as someone worthy. Liquid is spilled in the Odyssey. In this case, it's a water bowl that's tipped over onto Odysseus. Liquid is spilled on Jesus by this jar being broken. Euryclea anoints Odysseus. In the Gospel, the woman, I believe it's Mary, anoints Jesus. Discussion shifts immediately to Odysseus' enemies, meaning the suitors and the unfaithful servants, and the discussion in the Gospel immediately shifts to Jesus' betrayal, meaning Judas. An interesting side note is that Odysseus, Euryclea, did not know who Odysseus was at first, but she did notice him, or did figure out who he was, because she noticed that he had wounds in his feet, I believe it was. And of course, in the Gospels, that is later brought in, where the disciples don't recognize Jesus, but they do recognize him by the wounds in his hands and side. Euryclea The name Eurycleia means renowned far and wide. And in the gospel, it says, what this woman has done will be remembered wherever the gospel is preached. The same words are used in Greek by both Odysseus and Jesus when they say, it is I, or ego eimi. The same exact words. The last one, Castor and Pollux. Castor and Pollux were famous sailors. They're the sons of Zeus, who was the god of thunder. So they are the sons of thunder. They're pictured in ancient art on either side of Zeus, the seated deity. In the gospel, the sons of thunder are identified as James and John. In Mark 3:17, they're called James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, who were surnamed Boanerges, which is sons of thunder. And in Mark 10:36-37, Jesus says to these two men, these disciples, what do you want me to do for you? And they said to him, grant us to sit one at your right hand and one at your left in glory. Again, both sons, both sailors, both brothers, I said sons, both brothers, both sailors, both called sons of thunder, and both looking to sit on either side of the deity. So with that in mind, for someone that says, I never heard that before, what is mimesis and what's going on?
Yeah, so it might be helpful to circle back to the story I was telling earlier about teaching at the evangelical school. So I taught there a few years, and my teaching evolved over the course of the years, and felt like it was getting pretty good at the end. But one of the questions I would get, especially maybe the second year, was, well, you're telling us that the gospel writers, Luke in the Gospel of Luke, in the book of Acts, imitated literary models. I think they had a hard time wrapping their head around it, and asked for a modern example. And so my third year, I did incorporate an exercise that helped students wrap their heads around it. So after we had that conversation about the chapter by Dennis and the chapter by Pete Enns, and what are different ways of thinking about what Dennis was saying about the use of literary models, we would transition then to an exercise where I'd break the students up into groups and then show them clips. I think it was 4 clips from the TV show Community. Do you know that show?
No.
So it's a show on NBC for a few years, but they do a lot of parodies, or I think they preferred to call them homages to other TV shows and to movies and pop culture generally. But I was able to find clips where it's very clear. You can figure out what is going on. So they're referring to Law and Order, SVU, or Mad Men, or Glee, or something. And so I'd show them the clips and ask them in their groups, what is being parodied, or what is the homage to, and how can you tell? And so to get them to think about, what are the parallels? What are the distinctive characteristics that signal what is at play? So we'd go through those 4, and then I'd give them a handout with 2 texts, one on each side. One was from Luke 7, and one was from 1 Kings 17. So Luke 7 is Jesus raising a widow's son who had died. And 1 Kings 17 is Elijah raising a widow's son who had died. And so given what they just did, the exercise of looking for the parallels and distinctive features, in those same groups, they would figure out what are the parallels. So I told them, assuming, let's start with the assumption Luke imitated this passage from 1 Kings. How would you know? And also, what is the point of doing that? And so it would go through, and that one has a very nice verbatim repetition of he gave him to his mother, which seems like it'd be an unnecessary phrase, but it's in both the Septuagint of 1 Kings 17 and in Luke. But plenty of things in order. And at the end of the 1 Kings account, the mother of the widow whose son died says something to the effect of a true prophet has come among us. And in Luke, I think it's something to the effect of a prophet from God has come. And so what is the point of it? The type of answer I would try to get from the students is Luke is trying to convey Jesus is like Elijah, right? You know who Elijah is, and now it's somebody, Jesus is like Elijah. You don't know, we'll say you don't know who Jesus is. This is a point of reference for you. It's like, he's like Elijah, right. But greater than Elijah also. So that was like the full first class exercise of introduction to literary models. What
was their responses when you did that? Did some of them, was it like their minds were blown, or were they just curious?
Well, I don't want to flatter myself and say I blew their minds, but I think I intentionally chose an imitation of the Septuagint, right, the Hebrew Bible, because it's uniquely non-threatening. Right, to say the New Testament imitates the Old Testament, it does kind of challenge what a lot of them think, but it's not really threatening beyond that. Like, okay, well, they're both in the Bible, so what's the big deal?
So at that point, you weren't talking about Homeric epics yet. You're just doing Old Testament to New Testament.
Not yet, yeah. So eventually, we would in the semester we would talk about Homer and Virgil and Euripides as best we could, but to establish a baseline and to establish the framework, so they had a frame of reference for understanding what I was talking about later. Like this is all we're talking about. Luke presenting this story about Jesus in a way that mirrors the structure of this story about Elijah. For the point, presumably, I think it's a reasonable conclusion to present Jesus as a figure like Elijah. Yeah. And so when later we see. Paul, his shipwreck is like Odysseus's shipwreck. Well, it's not super threatening because in that framework, it's just to present Paul like a figure like Odysseus and to communicate the shipwreck in an entertaining way and in a way that recalls the story of Odysseus. Yeah. Or presenting the persecution of early Christians as akin to Pentheus's persecution of Dionysus, right? So the king of Thebes persecuting the wine god for introducing this new religion. There are a lot of parallels that are kind of obvious with Christianity, or early Christianity, or the Jesus movement. Yeah. And I think they, at least the author of Acts, tried to capitalize on those similarities and use them to communicate about what Christianity was and to legitimate it in some ways.
When you're thinking about the people of that era and these stories, the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Bacchae, and the Iliad, anything else that comes to mind, the people the people that era would have understood those stories. They were, at least if you had any education, like that was part of the curriculum. So they would have picked up by and large on a lot of these parallels very quickly.
Yeah, I think that's my argument. Some people wouldn't. And so I think that's where you have to make allowances. Like these stories about Jesus and the apostles make sense without reference to the Odyssey or the Aeneid or the Bacchae. Right. But I think you can make a case that it is credible to read them in relation to those stories, and there is meaning when you do so.
So just touching back on the idea of in current day are different versions of Christianity, of my background, which was more literal, every word of God is exactly true, and unless it specifically says it's metaphorical, read it as literal story. And then you have other people, the whole spectrum of to progressive Christianity. And I've even heard, I've got a friend I talked with about some of this a little bit, and the point of it is almost to the level of, it really doesn't matter if it's all made up. Jesus is still God, even if every story is mythological, and which I personally don't understand that perspective, but that's where she's at. But when you look at this, how much of it do you think was just not ironic? I think the word comes to mind first, but I think it's more than that. Not ironic, but there's just, it's not just a literary similarity. It's almost, it looks like they were either rewriting it But like, the name of your hero is such and such. Well, we're going to take the same story and rewrite our hero's name in it. Or it was maybe a flipped ending where, all these things happened, and in the end, it happened this way, but in our story, all these things happened and went that way. Mm-hmm. Where they're clearly trying to, tip the scales at the end in one way or the other. All these parallels, all these rewrites, all of these ways of doing it, like how much of the New Testament, especially the Gospels and Acts, how much of this do you think is based on that? In other words, if you were to say, well, yeah, there's a lot of mimesis in the New Testament, but there's still a lot that has nothing to do with mimesis. It's just plain old Bible history. This happened, this happened. How big is this? I would call it an issue, but I don't want to make it sound like it. But how big is this dynamic in the New Testament?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would like the designation of biblical history because it can mean different things to different people and has connotations that I think we would be importing onto the biblical texts. I haven't thought enough about the question of percentages, like how much of New Testament narratives is mimetic and how much is more straightforward storytelling.
Well, coming back to what you just said, is it history in any sense?
I mean, in some sense, maybe.
I mean, in the sense of like, take any story, that he's preaching on a hill. He feeds the 5,000. He goes in and upends the temple, or the money changers in the temple. Are these stories all made up? Not made up, but are they all derived from this, or are some of them just? There's like a lot of stories woven around a structure. Like there's a structure of Homer, but then like he's a skeleton, but there's a lot of meat that has nothing to do with Homer. Mm-hmm. Or is it more? Like if I'm reading it and I'm reading, got the Bible in front of me and I'm reading, pick a chapter, Luke 6, and then the next Luke 7. Am I reading this should I be reading this in a way to interpret it correctly as saying, like the first thought of my mind is where did this come from? Where is this copied from? Or is that the wrong way to say it? To say, yeah, that's interesting if you see a parallel, read it, but just read this as a story, as history. Like, how do you see that?
Reading as a story and reading as history are two different things.
Okay, good point.
And yeah, so...
I don't mean to box you. You can rephrase the question and answer it how you want to, whatever you feel appropriate.
So the question of if you notice a parallel, should you look at it? Sure, you should. It may not be, I think it may not be credible to read it with a parallel. So Dennis MacDonald works out a number of criteria that he uses to establish how reasonable it is to, and so he lays out how well it does or does not meet the criteria, and he publishes it whether he thinks it's strong or whether he thinks it's weak. And so some people think that by doing that he's maybe believing even the weak ones, but really to hear him say it, he wants to throw everything against the wall and let other people decide what sticks. So there's a question of how credible is it to read. So I do a bit with the Book of Acts and Virgil's Aeneid, and I think there's reason to question the credibility of doing that with the language barrier, with the Aeneid being in Latin and Luke writing in Greek, and Luke is one of the better writers in the New Testament, but he's no Plutarch, right? There's no obvious reason to think he knew Latin, but also these stories were communicated outside of Latin, right? So in Greek translations, but also in other performances of various kinds, and in other media such as art and sculptures and friezes and so when I talk about the Book of Acts relating to the Aeneid, I try to limit it to, I don't really look for word-to-word correspondences, because I'm not convinced Luke is using a copy of the Iliad, but I think he knows the story. And so when I compare it, I try to limit it to comparisons of what is the structure, what is the story, what are the images that Virgil uses that Luke could be referring to and playing with.
Sure.
But some people would say that's not credible. I'm sure they have and they will. So yeah, you're going to find parallels. Some of them you have to make the case that you think it's credible and see what other people think. Or, I mean, if you are convinced yourself, then stick with it. But
do you have any particular mimesis stories that you've seen and studied that are your favorites?
That are my favorites. Like the ones that I've found out, or
yeah,
like
just something that really fascinates you, like that one that we went over before, the Eurycleia, where her name literally means renowned far and wide, and Mary spills the perfume on Jesus to anoint him, and she's going to be known far and wide. Like that's just pretty cool. It's not just like the story and the structure. It's like the actual name is like hidden, and I think that stuff's kind of cool to see that.
Yeah. Well, I think I gravitate toward the cases of mimesis where you can make sense of why. Like I think it's completely legitimate to say, well, Luke is writing a story about this, and Homer has this sort of paradigmatic story about that, and that's why Luke imitates it. And there's no further meaning to be drawn. That's certainly possible, but it makes it harder to convince other people. And so I try to think about stories where it makes sense that this is being imitated. The one that's coming to my mind is about Joseph and Aseneth, but that might take a bit to get into. But
it's a really big one. I was saying, it's a really big story, but we can definitely save it for the next time we visit. But it's up to you if you want to tackle it.
Yeah, well, I think I can relate it to the Book of Acts, because that's something I will be working on. So Dennis does, I think, a really good job of describing the Cornelius episode. So Peter and Cornelius. Cornelius is a Roman soldier, and in the Book of Acts, he's the first non-Jew, like completely non-Jew, to join the movement of Jesus followers. And the way Luke describes it, Cornelius has a vision. An angel appears to him and says, "Send for Peter." And Peter is in Joppa. The centurion's in Caesarea, so they're kind of nearby. Peter's in Joppa. He's on the rooftop, and he sees this vision of animals being lowered down. And so it has a lot of meanings going on with Jewish-Gentile relations, and how the Book of Acts wants to rethink that in certain ways. But also Dennis has shown that sort of dual portents, the portents that work together to enact a certain cause, I think he makes a very credible case that it has its roots in the Iliad, where Agamemnon receives a dream that tells him to attack the Trojans, and Odysseus confirms it by remembering this portent of snakes devouring sparrows, I believe. And these two work together to confirm this, but in the Iliad, it's all a divine deception. And it's not really the time for the Greeks to defeat the Trojans, and so a ton of Greeks die needlessly. In the Book of Acts, you see the same sort of structure working out, where there's these two portents working together, but not to bring about destruction, and not because God is capricious, but instead to unify, to bring in non-Judeans, non-Jews into this Jewish movement of Jesus followers. And so one thing, what I want to build on that is, and it's similar to what I see in Joseph and Aseneth, where it's using the Iliad. The Iliad and the Odyssey are fundamentally about the dangers of intercultural mingling, right? So the Trojan War happens because Paris takes away Helen, and then they have to invoke the Pact of Helen suitors, where if somebody violates it, they all have to go to war against the person who violates it. So that becomes the Trojan War. So the Trojan War is itself a story about the perils of intercultural mingling. If Paris and Helen didn't abscond together, all of that destruction wouldn't have happened. And so it's almost ironic to use that story or something from that story as a template for thinking about the actual intercultural mingling of Jews and Gentiles.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, but it's not the only way Luke does it, because also in that episode you have Peter as a Jonah type figure. He's in Joppa, which is the town that Jonah went to when God told him to go to Nineveh to preach to Gentiles. Peter is in Joppa already and receives a call to go to Gentiles, a Gentile, Cornelius, and he resists. So he resists with the vision of the animals being dropped down from heaven. He said, no, I will not eat these. And God repeatedly says, yes, eat them. He says, no. So he's reluctant, just like in a similar ways to Jonah being reluctant. But the story of Jonah is also about intercultural relations. And Jonah is himself a model of opposition to intercultural mingling. But Luke uses both this Homeric Trojan model and the Jonah model, but subverts them. So uses their model, evokes their thought worlds, but uses the power of those stories to affirm the incorporation of outsiders.
Yeah.
So that's the type of thing I've been thinking about lately.
That's fascinating, especially in light of the whole, Peter, versus Paul, with just the legalism. You need to be circumcised. Oh, no, you don't. You need to follow Jewish rituals and rules.
Right.
No, you don't.
Under what circumstances can Gentiles become part of this Jewish movement?
Yeah, and it's almost like Paul was pretty much opened the floodgates and said, believe in Jesus and you're in, and you don't need that. And you get the sense that there's the arguments, even within some of the texts, where you have, I was just thinking about this recently, where, you have Paul, whoever wrote it, saying, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols. Mm-hmm. But right before it, like 2 chapters earlier, he's saying, it's nothing if you eat meat or you don't. Mm-hmm. There is no idol, there's no false god, so why does it matter? It's no big deal. And 2 paragraphs or 2 chapters later, he's saying, this is don't do it. And it's like you wonder if they're actually doing interpolations, where they're just arguing within the text, where the first copy of Corinthians maybe has Paul saying it's not a big deal. Mm-hmm. Eat whatever meat you want, and then someone else has a copy where they kind of add in, oh yeah, yes, but don't do it. And so it's fascinating to see this, and the stuff with the women speaking in church, which I know you talk in a different context, but mm-hmm. women can speak in church, but then don't let women speak in church. They need to stay quiet and ask their husbands when they get home. And it's like they're arguing right there within the text itself. Yeah,
well, and just to put a fine point on it, like this isn't I think a lot of times there's been a dichotomy established of Judaism being particular and Christianity being universal. And it's really a false dichotomy, because Christianity has plenty of very particular manifestations and Judaism has plenty of universal manifestations. And with this specific issue of Gentile inclusion, the book of Acts can be situated along a spectrum of Jewish perspectives on the appropriateness of Gentile inclusion and under what circumstances Gentiles should be allowed to be incorporated. Very much similar to Joseph and Aseneth. And in the article that I have coming out soon on Joseph and Aseneth, I make this exact argument that it uses the story of Helen as a model. So Helen as a part of that whole Trojan epic cycle, but uses it in this counterintuitive way. But it also uses other stories from the Hebrew Bible in counter to the story of Dinah, but also the story of David and Goliath. but it uses all these stories that are like about the perils of intercultural relations, but uses them as models for doing the exact opposite.
Yeah. Like
But
they're
yeah,
doing
so
the
that's
same
all to
story
say
and then
that,
go in different directions.
yeah, like a bait and switch of some kind. So the article, I call it the Trojan horses, because it's like bringing in this opposite idea of it's not what it looks like.
Yeah.
But yeah, all that is to say that what Acts seems to be doing with respect to Judaism and Gentile relations doesn't really represent a break from other previous manifestations of Judaism. It's just it can be situated right on the spectrum.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I love the whole bait and switch thing, and this is something that what I'm about to say I can't be more specific on because I honestly forget. But it was something I was studying like a month or two ago, where one of the ancient Greek philosophers, one of their things that they taught their students about the way they do the stories was to say, look for the things that don't make sense in the way you read the story that I wrote, maybe, or the stories you're about to write yourself. Like whatever is like, this makes sense, this makes sense. Oh wait, that looks out of place. That's the point of the story. And there's something in, I think, one of the journeys of Paul or something. But and again, I apologize. I'll get the details for our next visit. But it's like Paul or Jesus. He goes here and here and here and here, and then the next place that they go, it's like way out of, like, you wouldn't go there next. It'd be like going from Philadelphia to New York to Colorado. It's like you go to Philadelphia to New York, maybe up to Connecticut, but you're not going to go Philadelphia, New York, Colorado. And it's something like that. But like, that's the point. It didn't happen that way, but there's something about this you need to pay attention to. And I love that the people, again, that read this stuff, that were educated, they would have known to pick up some of these clues and say, there's a backstory to this. And where we go with that is obviously up to people's interpretation now, but they definitely, like, when I grew up, there was always this push of context, get the context, get the Greek and Hebrew context, get the context of like, if this is your verse of your chapter, of your whole book, and the historical context. And to me, if people don't include this kind of information in that context,
right,
you're missing so much. I mean, no matter where you land on atheism versus theism, it's just, if you want to understand the book, you got to know what the original people were thinking. And a lot of them were thinking about Homer, about, Euripides, just as like a reflex. They couldn't not. It'd be like reading a story about, a man with a red cape who could fly and save people. You're probably, in this day and age, going to think probably Superman. And, to ignore that would be at your peril of missing the parallels. I was just going to read one more that I thought, if I can add one more that I found fascinating. Hector, in the book of Mark, there's this story of Jesus' death and burial, and Hector in the Iliad. They're both young men who suffer a violent death. 3 women weep from a distance at their death. There's an older man who needs to go rescue the corpse. And the death of Hector leads to the fall of Troy. And for Mark, the death of Jesus anticipates the destruction of Jerusalem. And even within it, there's this woven this story that's not Jesus versus Hector, but just the actual names. For in Mark, Joseph is the father of Jesus, but it's another Joseph of Arimathea, whose last name means excellent discipleship, who's the one that takes the corpse. Mary is the mother of Jesus, but it's 2 other women named Mary who come to the tomb. Peter is obviously a disciple of Jesus, but it's not Peter who carries the cross, but his namesake, Simon of Cyrene, who carries the cross. And it's almost like this implication where they're leading people to consider, be more faithful than Jesus's own close family and friends were. And that's amazing to me. And the other one I was going to bring up, that maybe if you want to, this might be a good place to wrap up, but just the whole Kings versus Mark thing that you touched on. Scholars have known that there's an important role in what they call the Elijah-Elisha cycle, which is from around 1 Kings 16 through 2 Kings 13, that it plays an important role in the gospel narratives, particularly Mark, and that they recognize the importance of the ancient Greco-Roman practice of mimesis or imitatio for an impact in interpreting these gospels. And could you tell us, maybe to wrap up here, what is Mark doing versus Kings? Is Jesus like a new prophet, or how are they doing that?
Yeah, I'm guessing you're referring to Adam Wynn's book. Is that what you're looking at?
I was not at the moment, but yeah, it might be. There's a few I need to catch up on.
Book on it, probably
okay.
behind me, but yeah. So it's been a while since I've looked at it. I assume, like, I think the way I'd assume it is working is that, yeah, Jesus is a figure like Elijah and Elisha, so the audience knows about these figures, and so. If you want to explain who Jesus is, and if you want to say Jesus is like these figures, you would imitate those stories. And yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. Like the straightforward conclusion to recognizing that is that Jesus is like Elijah or Elisha,
or perhaps the better. He's the better everything. Better everything.
How it's executed, yeah, it can be done in such a way that Jesus is clearly superior to.
Yeah. There's the first Adam, and he's the second Adam who's perfect. There's the Moses, the lawgiver. He's the bringer of the new law of grace, and all that. On and on. He's the David's the great king, but Jesus is the true king, and it's fascinating to see how they pull that together. I will admit, I know we're not going to go into this today, and we'll wrap up here in a second, but I'm fascinated by the Astro Theology. There's something in me that pulls back to it. Obviously, Elijah, going up into heaven on a chariot. Elisha, the bald man, the moon man. Elijah being the sun, Elisha being the moon. Elisha with the 42 children, and he curses them in the name of God, and then 2 bears, which is ironically, Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, come out and kill the kids. Very astro-theological figures in the Old Testament, and yet you have Jesus copying them, and I get pulled into that so deeply where I just think, if nothing else, and I won't draw conclusions in this conversation, but just say we just need to know what they were thinking. And just like we need to know the mimesis, like if these people, either just the overall audience or maybe even the initiates of some secret version of it, if they understood some of this as signs of the zodiac, where the equinox, the star, sun, moon, stars, the planets, if they looked at this, they'd say, oh yeah, Jesus crucified between 2 thieves. We know what that means. Just look up at the sky at night, you'll see it. If they were thinking that, regardless of what we do with it today, like we just want to know what influences were put into this book. And I love what you're doing. I can't wait to read your book. Again, it's called Roman Self-Representation and the Lukan Kingdom of God. And I'm definitely going to be digging into your other papers. And I would just say thank you for bringing these issues to our attention and helping us to understand what's going on. I know we've come to different conclusions theologically, but I love your expertise, and just wanted to see if you had any final thoughts on this of all we've talked about that you wanted to add to wrap us up.
Sure. Well, I'll add that in that book, I do have a chapter on Jesus' ascension in the book of Acts and comparing it with that of Elijah in 2 Kings 2, but also with the disappearance of Romulus in a cloud. So those stories, and then the way that Luke in Acts chapter 1 seems to imitate elements from one and from the other, and in a way that, so if you looked at the way that the ascension in Acts imitates that of Elijah, it accounts for a lot of the details, but the details that are missed, at least in my reading, are covered by an imitation of the Romulus story. So you might enjoy that.
That's fascinating. I'm just guessing, I don't know, but is Romulus also an astrotheological person? Like, is he connected to a sign of the zodiac or a star?
That I don't know.
Gotcha. I'll have to look that up. I'll save that for our next chat. But that'll be my home. I'll take this as my homework. What your book is coming out shortly, right? It's November.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
So I think I've seen most of the proofs. I think we're waiting on final cover proofs, but then it'll go into press. So hopefully by November 15th it'll be out. But
this is your first book that you've written just by yourself?
Solo authored book. Yeah, there are 2 other books that I've co-edited with Claremont Press.
Okay. Final question: where do you go from here? What's your next big project or book or focus for your studies?
Yeah, so I'm working on a couple of conference papers that I'll be presenting in a couple of months. One of which will be I need to work into an article. The other one is actually we talked about it, the way that both Joseph and Aseneth and the Book of Acts use literary models that themselves are about the dangers of intercultural mingling, but they both use it for the opposite purpose. So that's what that paper will be about. The other, I'm looking at Rhoda, the slave girl in Acts 12, who answers the door when Peter, who has escaped from prison, knocks, and then she goes. And so picking up on what Dennis has argued, reading her as Cassandra figure. So Cassandra is the famous Greek figure who was given the gift of prophecy, but for certain reasons was cursed with the inability to ever convince anybody of that. So I guess she was Trojan, right? So she advised against receiving the Trojan horse, but nobody believed her. And she was taken as a slave by Agamemnon after the Trojan War, and knew that Clytemnestra was going to kill them, but Agamemnon didn't listen. And playing out with the distinction, with the ways in which that story in Acts plays with the Cassandra story, but also the ways in which it plays with understandings of class and gender, and why it would make sense for the audience to see Rhoda as somebody who's not to be believed. So playing with those sorts of ideas. And the bigger project I'm working on is a book manuscript on sort of what we talked about with the Book of Acts, with its use of literary models and the ways that it contradicts some of them, the way in which it uses them, some of the ways that it uses literary models in intuitive ways, and some ways that are just not intuitive. But to talk about Gentile inclusion, and then opposition to Gentile inclusion, and then defending it. And in the same way, talking about the ways that Peter and Paul are presented as sort of mirrors of each other within the Book of Acts. So all of that is hopefully going to be in that project.
And how many years would it be before we'd possibly see that book? It'll
be a couple at least.
Okay. Gosh, yeah. That sounds a bit fascinating too. I got to admit, just in terms of painting a picture, word picture, do you know the Matrix, where Morpheus offers him the blue pill and the red pill, and it's like, if you take this one, you're going to see how far the rabbit trail goes, and it does seem like the more you get into this stuff, the more you realize that there's layer upon layer. It's like an onion, and it is, and it's I'm fascinated by it. I've got I know there's some people that you would come across who are of a similar conclusion as I am in terms of theology, that would just say, I just like studying this stuff. I'm just fascinated by it. My goal is a little bit different. I'm looking to help people who study this to consider deconversion, to consider that this is actually a very bad worldview, and that it's abusive even to children to teach them this. But whether you go that way or it's just a fascinating study that you just find curious, you got to admit there are so many layers. I mean, it's like looking at someone that knows how to do Photoshop really well. It's like layer upon layer upon layer upon layer, and the end goal is amazing. I mean, it's an amazing story, whether you agree with the worldview or not. It's an amazing book. I mean, and I'm fascinated too by the question of who wrote it. When you look, you start studying stuff like the ancient, the Library of Alexandria, and just who did this? Who has the ability to be both, Jewish, mystical? I mean, they obviously know the Old Testament super well. They obviously know all these Greek things that we're talking about, and probably some other things. Ancient religions, from what I've studied, they're copycatting a lot of the ancient religious figures. They're probably weaving in Astro Theology. They're weaving in numerology, gematria. They're probably weaving in some of the Pythagorean cult, and the codes that they would put in. And you think, yes, there are discrepancies. Yes, there's things you can say, this doesn't match that. But when you try to put them aside for a second, you say, just look at it as a book that they did their very best. They did an amazing job weaving all these different facets together. And I'm fascinated by who did it. And I would say, if we can ever dive into that, I would love to. I don't know if that's a 2-minute conversation or a 2-hour conversation, but I would love to hear your thoughts. I'll let you decide if it's a 2-minute conversation, if we should table that one for next time.
It might be a 2-minute for me.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, from what I would say is a lot of that is just in the air.
Okay.
So it wouldn't necessarily take a lot of study. It's just the cultural air they breathe. And one insight that I think helps MacDonald's arguments, and he doesn't get enough credit for it from people who are critical of him, is if you were literate in Greek, if you could write in Greek, you were exposed to Homer. Yeah. Like there's no question. It's Homer dominated literate education. So you learned how to write Greek by copying lists of names from Homer, or you learned how to compose by composing hypothetical scenes from Homer. And so really the least surprising thing in the world should be the suggestion that the New Testament sometimes imitates Homer, because it's written in Greek. Yeah. so of course they know Homer. So but it is taken as a bit of a bridge too far by a lot of scholars. But it doesn't make sense to me. But for a lot of the other things, I mean, you're not necessarily having one person familiar with all those. So with a collection of early Christian writings, some are going to evoke different thought worlds.
That's true. And there may be multiple people working on some of these books for all we know, or edits
for all we know,
later.
Yeah, we don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly edits and redactions and even scribal editions later.
Right. There's some that we know of and some we may never know of.
Yeah. Well, I've got to say, this has been awesome. I've loved what you've had to say. I feel like I probably could have added another 20, 30, 40 questions, but I'm going to table them and hopefully dive into some of your works and be able to craft those questions even better based on what I read of your work. I'm looking forward to reading your book here, hopefully in a few weeks, months when it comes out. And I wish you the best for that. I hope it takes off and hits a broad audience.
Thank you.
And I thank you for your time doing this with me.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
And everyone, again, Dr. Michael Kochenash. Is that correct?
That's right.
I'm going to work on that pronunciation.
You got it.
Dr. Michael Kochenash, and again, currently he's in the U.S., but we'll be following your work and looking forward to future interactions with you. Thank you for your expertise and for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much.